Okay, so it is 6 o'clock, so we will begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 12B on masculinities. My name is Cynthia Fowler, and I'm an art historian. I teach at Emmanuel College in Boston. I'm sorry you are all not gathered in Boston for this symposium, but maybe I'll see you in September. So because we have 5 panelists, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with an introduction. I think we should just go forward with the papers. And I will start with Cecilia Gunzburger. Cecilia is a textile historian on the faculty of the Smithsonian George Washington University Master's Program in Decorative Arts and Design History. And her paper is titled To Embellish Himself with Cloth, Handkerchiefs, and Civility. Cecilia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'm happy to be part of this. I am now going to share my screen. So, in early modern Europe, lace-trimmed linen garments and furnishing textiles emerged as part of the performance of developing ideas of cleanliness and civility in the 16th and 17th centuries. Today, I'd like to explore the role of one type of lace-trimmed linen object within this context, the handkerchief. So elite European men and women began to be depicted holding handkerchiefs in their portraits in about 1470. And the handkerchief portrait reached a zenith from 1550 to 1600 and faded in popularity by 1620. The height of this handkerchief portrait coincides with the period in which cutwork needle lace is the most fashionable embellishment on handkerchiefs and on all types of linens. Material and visual evidence from extant handkerchiefs from the late 16th century can help explain their importance and why they were considered appropriate visual signifiers of status and civility for inclusion in elite European portraits in this period. Handkerchiefs evolved as a specialized form of object from a multi-purpose linen cloth that was known by multiple terms in the late medieval and early modern period. Our current English term kerchief derives from French couvre-chef, or to cover the head, while in French in the period they were called pleuvoir, from tear or cry, from wiping the eyes, or mouchoir. In English, hand cover, kerchief, napkin, which of course survives for a dining cloth and not a hand cloth. In Italian, fazzoletti, from face, or panetti, small cloth. All of these terms begin to appear and are used kind of interchangeably in inventories in Italy and France, beginning in the 14th century. In this scene of the birth of the Virgin on the left, we can see linen cloths being used to, for multiple purposes, to cover some bread that's being served on the left, to wash the hands of St. Anne, the new mother, and then of course to cover the heads of several of the women. So this multifunctional cleaning and grooming cloth evolved into specialized forms over the next several centuries, such as the dining napkin, which we see being carried by the servers, not used by the diners in this feast scene on the right, as well as the personal handkerchief, the washing towel, a headscarf or neck scarf. As soon as handkerchiefs appear in inventories, they also emerge as a literary trope, symbolizing love or sexual intimacy. They first occur in 14th century French romances in the trope that we still have with us today as a gift given by a lady to her courtly lover as a sign of her special favor. In this illustration of the story of Lancelot and the Holy Grail, the lady is wiping her eyes with her handkerchief in her grief at the death of the knight. They're at a tomb here, demonstrating the use of the textile to absorb and remove bodily excretions from the face. Perhaps the most well-known example of this trope in literature appears in Shakespeare's play Othello, in which Othello is convinced that his wife Desdemona has been unfaithful to him, to the point of stabbing her to death at the end by the sole proof that another man is in possession of her handkerchief. The handkerchief had become so strongly associated with the female owner's body that the presumed gift of it constituted proof of carnal knowledge of her body. And this association of the handkerchief with the personal body of the owner was not confined to literature, but part of interpersonal relations in real life as well. In 1565, Queen Elizabeth I was watching a tennis match between her favorite, Robert Dudley, who we see here, and another rival for her hand, the Duke of Norfolk, when Dudley, according to an eyewitness, quote, took the Queen's napkin out of her hand and wiped his face. So it's still being called a napkin at this point, but he's using it for its intended purpose, but he took the Queen's. The entire court was shocked by this, and the two men came to blows over his presumption in taking her handkerchief and using it in this public way. And Elizabeth herself was, quote, offended sore with Dudley. It has even been suggested that Dudley included a handkerchief in this portrait that we see here in reference to this incident and in defense of his intimacy with the Queen, although there's no documentary evidence for this. It's just that that story exists and this portrait exists. While in material form, it seems that handkerchiefs are a specialized form of that larger multifunctional furnishing cloth of the 14th century. The handkerchief's close association with the body is more easily understood by observing the relationship between handkerchiefs and undergarments in this era. That handkerchiefs were conceived of as an extension of the undergarment and thus as personal body linen, rather than as a furnishing or grooming textile that could be used by multiple people in the household, is suggested by how it is described in books of manners of the era. In 1530, Erasmus of Rotterdam advises in his etiquette manual for training boys for courtly life that it is proper for a boy to, quote, embellish himself with a cloth in order to blow his nose into a handkerchief. And this is necessary to distinguish himself from rustics and tradesmen who wipe their noses on their sleeves in a very uncouth manner. So it seems that using the sleeve to blow one's nose was the usual practice, with the sleeve of the undergarment serving to absorb not only the sweat of the parts of the body in which it comes into contact while worn, but also the parts of the body that are not covered by the undergarment, such as the face and hands. Using a separate piece of linen instead of the sleeve itself was part of the code of civilized behavior constructed by elite members of society in the 15th and 16th century. Other books of manners in the 16th century also recommend employing a handkerchief to wipe the brow and to spit into, while a 16th century Italian dancing manual recommends that ladies tuck their handkerchiefs into their sleeves while dancing. So there is this continued association of handkerchiefs with sleeves. There's at least one portrait of a man that depicts his handkerchief tucked into his sleeve, although they were obviously carried in purses and in the hand as well. In portraiture, I guess I'm not getting to this, in the 16th and 17th centuries, sitters surrounded themselves with objects that reflected their presentation, their self-presentation to the world. Handkerchiefs are only one commonly depicted object that elite men and women hold in portraits. Other common objects are leather-bound books, ostrich feather fans, gloves richly embroidered with silk and with silver and gold lace. In addition to the clear signaling of wealth through these expensive objects, all of these objects function as signifiers of civility, connoting education and literacy, access to global trade networks for exotic feathers, and attention to cleanliness through handkerchiefs and gloves. The use of linen cloth proliferated exponentially in Europe, beginning in the 14th century, as body linen replaced bathing as the means of cleaning the self. Cleanliness had been achieved by bathing in water. So finally, we're getting to this fun image here of a feast, a hot tub party, right, in the 15th century. So cleanliness had been achieved by bathing in water until periodic outbreaks of the bubonic plague, beginning in the 14th century, caused public gathering places, such as bathhouses, to be shunned. So they wanted to practice social distancing and not have these large public gatherings. In place, evolving medical ideas, well, they were shunned in part because evolving medical ideas blamed bad air for disease, and water was theorized to open the skin's pores to the bad air and emitting disease. So public bathhouses were condemned as vectors of disease. The last public bathhouses in Europe were closed when London's were outlawed in 1546. To replace bathing in water, medical physicians developed a theory of hygiene in which linen fiber absorbed impurities. And the wearing and wiping of the body with linen cloth replaced bathing in water to remove dirt along with agents of disease. As linen was becoming essential to this performance of cleanliness and hygiene, cleanliness itself was becoming an essential piece of these codes of civility. Norbert Elias, the foundational scholar of the history of manners, emphasized in his multi-volume work, This Civilizing Process, the crucial importance of the control of bodily functions to this code of civility, along with the control of speech and behavior and strong emotions. As cleanliness became important to social status, linen objects through which this cleanliness was performed and signaled became increasingly visible. Undergarments began to show at the edges of outer garments, furnishing linens appear in paintings, and when these are visible, they become embellished. Rich embroidery is mentioned from the 15th century, but white linen embellishment, white on white, what's called white work, had become the standard by the mid-16th century. The fine linen thread was certainly expensive, and the cloth, but the major expense in this white work, embroidery and lace, open work lace, was the extensive labor required both to produce it and then to maintain its whiteness through frequent laundering and bleaching. The association of the handkerchief with the shift, or the woman's undergarment, or what we might call a slip or something, is also supported by the coordination of the embellishment on these items that is evident in the handkerchief portraits. In many cases, the cutwork and needle lace decoration of the edges of the undergarment, the collars and cuffs, and the handkerchief matches or coordinates very closely. In one of the earliest depictions of spectacular fully formed Reticella needle lace embellishment is this portrait of the Spanish Infanta, in which her handkerchief, collar, cuffs, and collar employ the same motifs and layouts in a slightly different scale. The handkerchief and cuff match more closely, whereas the points on the collar are slightly larger. scaled to the size of the accessory itself. It would appear that they were made as a set, intended to be worn and displayed together, with the handkerchief not only with its literary and historical associations, but in its material and visual form, a part or extension of the undergarment. So were these made as sets? They clearly must have been, but how? Cutwork needle lace necessarily must be worked on a ground cloth. So it doesn't lend itself to production as yardage, like long lengths of trimming, which would be the easiest way for a consumer to construct a matched set of accessories. Indeed, extant handkerchiefs confirm that cutwork needle lace borders were made as individual items and not as yardage sewn into the trim around the handkerchief. In this handkerchief, the borders worked as a square on a single piece of ground cloth. The central plain square is separate and attached with those tiny little wheat ear insertion stitch, like bobbin lace insertion stitch. But the border itself is made as a single piece on a single piece of ground cloth. Cutwork is created by cutting away portions of the ground cloth and embroidering around the cut edges. In the later 16th century, almost all of the ground cloth was cut away in squares, leaving a grid of usually only 4 threads on which to work the needle lace fillings. So in these diagrams, it shows how a square has been cut away out of a ground cloth there on the left, and leaving, here there's only 3, usually there's 4 in the actual textiles, threads forming a cross. Then using a needle and thread, the lace maker can lay down diagonals and curved lines to this grid and cover and embellishing them with looped stitches. And this type of lace is usually termed Reticella, which is the Italian for little net. All of the admittedly small sample of extant handkerchiefs and borders that I have been able to analyze thus far were worked as individual pieces. In this example, the center portion of the ground cloth has been cut away, but you can see some of the threads. There's one at the very bottom of that detail there of the ground cloth that remain, that show that it was worked on a single piece of cloth. The central parts are often missing because they're most likely to become stained or worn through use, and they could be cut away and then replaced. The binding or hem stitching at the borders of the cutwork embellishment stabilizes the ground cloth, even though there's hardly any of it left, so that the center can be cut out without damaging the expensive border. And it can be replaced so that the investment in that needle lace border is not exhausted so quickly. And this is another one, similar example with the hem stitching around the center, but that was worked on a single piece of ground cloth, including the center. On this piece, the center has been replaced. It is newer in replacement. It looks a little bit brighter, but the ground was worked on, or all the embellishment was worked on a single piece of ground to start with in this fabulous diagonal, which is even more difficult to conceive and work than doing it on a straight grain grid. Lace makers did eventually develop a method of making needle lace independent of a ground cloth by laying narrow braids, which you can see at the inner and outer edges of this border, laying them down and stitching them onto a piece of cloth in place of the cut cloth. Is that my 1 minute?
Yes.
Okay. It was then possible to create trimming yardage independent of the object, but they continue to be produced to shape like this. And even this development did not supersede the production of single piece cloths. The question still remains as to how these coordinated collars, cuffs, and handkerchiefs were produced and acquired by their wearers. Records show that even in the 1560s and 70s, white work, needle lace piece goods were being produced in Antwerp and exported to Paris. And this practice continues, of course, through the 17th century and into the 19th century. In Italy, production was centered in convents on commission and a limited commercial basis. There was some home production, but at these high levels of production would probably not have been done at home. Sets could have been produced on commission, such as Isabella's later set when she's Archduchess of Austria, whereas consumers of more modest means may have done the delicate needle lace edging on the handkerchief, cuff, and collar here herself. I'll go through these last few a little bit quickly, which I didn't have a lot to say about anyway, except that the collar and handkerchief tend to match as we move to the end of the 16th and into the 17th century. They tend to match, whereas the collar deviates a bit more from the cuff and the handkerchief, which we are continuing to see. And just in conclusion, somewhat ironically, the fashion for handkerchief portraits wanes by 1620, at precisely the moment when bobbin lace, which is based on braiding and lends itself, it was always produced as yardage for trimming and lends itself much more easily to creating match sets. It comes into fashion, but the fashion for these portraits wanes. Although some people do continue to have their portraits painted, like this lady of the minor gentry, and it becomes sort of a ritualized form of court dress and presentation. So mostly it continues for these royal kind of dynastic portraits. So I can wrap up there since my time is up.
Thank you, Cecilia. So, okay, so our next presenter is Chloe Chapin. Chloe is a PhD candidate in American Studies at Harvard University, and her presentation today is Hidden in Plain Sight, Evening Dress in Black and White.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. Can everybody hear me okay?
Good.
Great, thank you. So the ensemble we know today as white tie developed in the early 19th century as an idealized expression of civilized Western masculinity, in stark contrast to the wide variety of color, pattern, and silhouette seen in the formal wear of European men prior to the 19th century in women's evening dress, and in the ceremonial dress of men in cultures not considered part of the system of Western fashion. In my dissertation, I am examining the codification process of this uniform between 1820, which you see on the left, when men first adopted black and white as a new idea of formal evening dress, and 1850 on the right, when other styles went out of fashion. And I do this in order to examine larger ideas about conformity, masculinity, and power, many of which are still prevalent today. In this paper, I consider the material significance of the colors of this uniform of men, black woolen cloth and starched white linens. Why black and white specifically? What was it about those particular colors that were so appealing to the most powerful people in the Western world that they adopted it as their uniform, one which has lasted more or less unchanged for 200 years? In regards to this conference's theme of hiddenness, the work of white men across Western Europe is hardly buried. Many objects examined in this conference are categorized by or overlooked in the archives, museums, and academic fields based around organizational principles that they created. But their lives as white men remain largely veiled. In fact, the elements that are unique to formal masculine attire, its visual sobriety and lack of variation between wearers and through time, are the very things that have resisted its collection, display, and analysis. I read the creation of this ensemble as intentionally obfuscating. Just as white men were codifying the world around them through scientific discovery and analysis, they created for themselves a uniform that was designed to resist classification. They marked themselves as unmarkable. In 1930, John Carl Flugel wrote of men's attire, "In the heavy and sober blackness of their shoes, in the virgin whiteness and starched stiffness of their collars and shirt fronts, men exhibit to the outer world their would-be strength, steadfastness, and immunity from frivolous distraction." But why is blackness sober and white virginal? And how do these colors together imply steadfastness and immunity from frivolity? Scholars of art history, anthropology, chemistry, physics, and neurobiology have seen color as a combination of physical properties and cultural meaning. Black and white can be understood as primary values outside of hue and chroma, though while scientists focused on values of light and dark might see black or white as a lack of color, a launderer will see white as a labor-intensive process, and a fabric dyer will know black as the presence of multiple colors. Reinforcing connotations of the primitive, black and white are often associated with primal human constructs, day and night, darkness and light. Unlike other color opposites, black and white rely on each other for their contrast in value rather than chroma. The symbolic reliance on an opposite for meaning can be read into gendered and racialized origins of the suit. I read black and white beyond color opposites as material categories with parallel operations of extraction that encoded colonial attitudes of civic and moral authority and gendered ideas of power into this seemingly unclassifiable ensemble. Often overlooked in color research that focuses on the symbolic is the material difference between color in nature, pigments for paint, and dyestuffs for textiles. And here I first make a broad methodological argument for ways that historians can consider the important specificity of textiles in thinking through broader ideas of color symbolism through these four themes. Because color is created by material substances, symbolic value can vary from one geography to another. In the pre-modern world, color came from the natural environment, and where one lived dictated the availability of particular colors. The labor of extraction or production and distance of travel contributed to the high monetary cost of colorant, which then translated into the high symbolic value of the color. Because of this, color in the pre-modern world was likely a quite local in addition to cultural experience. A well-known example of this is the infamous Lincoln green worn by the legendary Robin Hood. The town of Lincoln was one of the wealthiest of medieval England, thanks to its superior wool trade, particularly their green dyed woolens. Black is notoriously one of the most difficult colors to both achieve and maintain, often requiring the layering of a number of ingredients, as well as the addition of mordants, particularly to resist future fading. Dye woods, in particular, compared to the dye stuffs that come from plants rather than trees, purportedly degrade fibers at different rates. Colors in textiles thus have critical temporal qualities. They don't just produce visible chroma, they have to maintain that color over time through exposure to sunlight and rainstorms, wearings, and washings. This need for multiple ingredients or a lack of stability over time may contribute to their resistance to being easily marked or categorized, untraceable to a single local source. People may have associated colors with particular plants or their linked kinship qualities, as many of the plants used for dyestuffs were also used for cooking or medicinal purposes. The color yellow, as Elizabeth Wayland Barber has noted, was associated with women in ancient Greece, likely because the saffron plant, which was used in yellow dyeing, was also used medicinally for menstrual cramps. Ironically, the logwood dye that produces the black cloth more commonly associated with men is also used in histology for blood work such as pap smears. There was also a really fascinating conversation earlier today with the Baltimore Dye Collective about plants and traditional knowledge and healing, which would be really interesting to put into conversation with this. So 17th century French manual on dyeing noted that, quote, "A black cannot be perfect without the addition of logwood, which makes cloth blacker, more lustrous, softer, and more durable." Dyeing with oak galls or other tannins such as sumac leaves purportedly produced a black cloth with an inferior hand. In other words, logwood dyed woolens were softer or more pliable to the touch and had better draping qualities. This implies that textile colorants also contributed to the haptic as well as visual experience of the fabric, with certain dye stuffs producing a shinier, softer, more pliable fabric, along with changing the superficial color. These local, complex, familial, and tangible experiences of color are easy to overlook as global strategies of trade conducted extractive processes on increasingly larger scales, but bear keeping in mind when considering the impact of colors on fashionable dress practices. Materials used in pre-modern Europe to achieve a good, light, fast black included indigo, walnut and oak galls, sumac, and logwood, frequently in combination with each other. 19th century dye sample books demonstrate almost imperceptible nuances of the blacks that could be achieved with natural materials. Each recipe was based on the fiber type, with different recipes and methods for dyeing wool, silk, cotton, or linen. According to many sources, the key ingredient for achieving a good black dye was the aforementioned logwood, which was discovered to produce a soft, brilliant, and color-fast dye along with copper as a mordant or fixative, and was further improved around 1840 by the incorporation of a chrome mordant. By the 19th century, logwood was the most widely used of all dyes, and even a century after the first use of synthetic dye in the mid-20th century, the world consumption of logwood was as much as 70,000 tons. Pre-modern textile production in Europe relied on access to native plant sources of naturally occurring dyestuffs, and was frequently the motivation behind colonial settlements in tropical climates. The colorant hematoxylin is derived from the heartwood of the logwood tree, Hematoxylum campechiantum, which is native to the mangrove swampland of Central America, along with mahogany, though logwood was initially considered the more valuable commodity. Originally Maya territory, access to this land was fought over by the British and Spanish during the so-called Logwood Wars throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1798, the Battle of St. George's Cay won the British the rights to the logging areas they later called British Honduras, now modern-day Belize. British access to logwood may have contributed to the increased popularity for black clothing in both menswear and morning dress throughout the 19th century, particularly as they transplanted the tree to other British colonies around the Caribbean. Dye woods were imported in the form of short logs, hence the name logwood. To produce the dye, the outer wood was discarded and the heavy heartwood broken up into chips, after which they would be rasped or powdered into a finer sawdust, which was necessary for the dyeing of wool because larger pieces had proven difficult to remove from the cloth. The labor involved in chopping down and extracting the heavy wood from soggy and mosquito-infested swamplands relied heavily on the enslaved labor of local indigenous people and imported African and Native Americans. The chipping and rasping of the heavy heartwood was equally extensive, and in the 16th century dye center of Amsterdam, this was a monopoly controlled by the government through the Rasphouse, named for the nature of the labor performed. In fact, the idea of modern prisons in Western Europe was developed around these wood rasping houses in which criminals and vagabonds were rounded up and pressed into the kind of cheap labor that would not have been economically feasible on the free market, thus dealing with both the problem of what to do with the poor and criminal and addressing the imposing task of rasping thousands of tons of dye wood annually. American men who celebrated the formality of black and white dress were well aware of the colonial source for their formal suits. When John Adams drafted the definitive peace treaty between the United States and Great Britain in 1783, it officially ended the American Revolutionary War. An early draft of Article 14 of the treaty specifically concerned the rights of the United States citizens to cut logwood on the condition that it be traded with Britain and not other European nations. John Quincy Adams later reported on treaty negotiations around the right to cut logwood in the Bay of Honduras in a report published in 1822. For these men and their contemporaries, Black had a location. Black was an essential part of a dense network of colonial extraction, enslaved and indentured labor, piracy, and international politics. Previous practices for Black and white in dress can also shed light on inherited cultural ideas of symbolic color value. Beginning in the 9th century, Benedictine monks were known as Monachii Nigri for Black robes purportedly representing humility and renouncement, though clearly there must have been some economic motivation due to the high cost of the Black dyes. Throughout the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, Black clothing was increasingly adopted as a way of signifying public authority and the law, and many people who held offices for the state or church began to wear Black as a sign of authority, including priests, judges, lawyers, doctors, and scholars, as well as experiencing phases of popularity in various aristocratic courts and the wealthy merchant class. Black faded from regular fashion during the 18th century in Europe, though it was increasingly used symbolically as mourning dress. In the early 19th century, when it was adopted for masculine evening dress, Black must have conjured up feelings of gravitas, spiritual purity, and moral authority because of its long association with mourning dress, church and government officials, civil servants, and the aristocracy. Black, and therefore the people who wore Black clothing, were associated with virtue and power and provided a consistent message of privilege across the Western world. New to the 19th century was its association with gender as a way to promote masculine rather than merely civic or aristocratic authority. While many fibers naturally exist in a range of hues, a cool, non-yellow white can be difficult to cultivate, achieve, or maintain. Furthermore, white is the one color in textiles that cannot be achieved by dyers. It requires a whole separate profession and process, focused more on extraction than addition. White fibers first need bleachers to achieve their unnaturally color-free state. Then, when white bed sheets or shirt fronts are soiled with other colors through the process of staining, they went to the laundry to be boiled, scrubbed, spot cleaned, and sometimes re-bleached, and then starched and ironed into shape again. For millennia, linens had been bleached white by the sun or by caustic and time-consuming methods involving lye and sour milk. In the latter half of the 18th century, the discovery of chlorine, which was then combined with first potash and then limestone by a weaver turned chemist, created calcium hypochlorite or bleaching powder, a critical invention that made possible masculine evening dress. By the 1840s, men's formal dress fashions featured tailcoats that were worn open or that buttoned low on the chest, exposing more and more of the white waistcoat underneath. Formal waistcoats also buttoned increasingly lower than their daytime counterparts, which left a greater amount of formal white shirt front exposed. The dress code that required expanses of white shirts and low-cut white waistcoats, specifically for the period of day when the largest meal was consumed, was clearly not motivated by practical necessity, but instead men flaunted these garments as a different kind of conspicuous consumption that suggested the cost of maintenance rather than acquisition. Just how many white garments must a man have had in his wardrobe at one time to comfortably allow for any number of them to be at the laundry while he went out to another dinner engagement, adjured by his wife to be more careful over the soup course? In the Western world, white clothing is both heavily symbolic and highly gendered. It was linked to Christian ideals of innocence and virginity in children's wear, and garments that marked both biological and spiritual rites of passage, such as christening gowns and wedding dresses. For at least 40 years prior to the adoption of masculine evening dress, it was also highly fashionable for women to wear all white, in a nod to simplicity and classical republicanism. Similarly, men wore white breeches in both civilian dress and military uniforms, and in fact, white trousers were at one point in the 1830s a fashionable element of masculine evening dress, like you see on the right here, though the style clearly did not last. Directions on appearance in early 19th century etiquette guides contained calls to personal neatness and cleanliness, which can be read alongside the value of clean linen. Of particular importance, claimed nearly every book on conduct, was the need for personal hygiene. No one can please in company, however graceful his air, claimed the 1831 guide Polite Present, unless he be clean and neat in his person. The Art of Good Behavior from 1845 admonished its readers, no man can be considered a gentleman, no woman treated as a lady who neglects cleanliness. It is the first requisite to health, serenity, comfort, and beauty. A clean man is half a gentleman. Correlations between cleanliness and morality conveniently overlooked the labor and expense that would have been paramount in considerations of personal hygiene in the mid-19th century. The promotion of cleanliness as an antidote to vulgarity erased the work that went into keeping both one's person and clothing clean in a world where running water was still a luxury. Despite the regular habits of the body of sweating, bleeding, soiling, and staining, linens bleached white were used as swaddling bands, diapers, menstrual pads, bandages, undergarments, and then, in a clearly impractical marker of class distinction, formal attire. Whiteness in textiles, I argue, was linked to spiritual purity through the material realities of body linen. Cleanliness in washing away the stains of the body translated symbolically into spiritual piety and moral goodness. Unlike dyed woolens, which could not be laundered, clean linens represented a rebirth, the body linen and spirit both purified and reborn, linking whiteness to piety. To frame this as a question, if linen had grown naturally in a dark brown color, would Western European Christians have cared so much about whiteness? When men adopted white linen as a critical, visible component of their most civilized selves, they doubly marked their gender and race as morally authoritative, responsible, free of sin, modern, rational, civilized. When considered separately, Blackness and whiteness have a highly specialized meanings that stem from their distinct material properties, imbued with local stories of gender and enslaved or indentured labor, and symbolism of purity and power. When brought together, the symbolism of black and white expand the meanings of each other even further in a dance of opposition, reflecting binary ideas that are encoded onto other cultural constructs. The racial categories that we call black and white in reality occupy a spectrum of colors from dark brown to alabaster. Any simple division between two distinct categories is clearly culturally defined. While the racial constructs of black and white have entirely different meanings than they do to either the painter or the dyer, symbolic meanings of darkness and light or good and evil have been projected onto skin tones through ideas of black and white that exist in an abstract realm beyond Pantone colors. Black and white color values are thus interwoven with cultural values of blackness and whiteness. To conclude, symbolic connections between the tactile and abstract meanings of black and white textiles have been entangled for centuries. Layers of material properties and symbolic meaning link to each other under ideas of blackness and whiteness brought together in the masculine evening suit. The color or non-colors of this ensemble have proved to be more than mere optical sobriety. They represent a global system of symbolism that has obfuscated the material politics of the local in a dense network of extraction, labor, global exchange, and moral convictions. The process of coloring or removing color from cloth in the 19th century was both extractive and exploitative, and dyestuffs were layered on top of each other in recipes that parallel a multiplicity of symbolic kinship meanings. Like the dyes or stains embedded in the fibers, some meanings held fast, while others faded over time or formed new associations. the haptic embodied experiences of color were enacted on bodies as symbols of class and civility. Black and white rely on each other to provide optical contrast as they demonstrate competing needs for luxury goods and the maintenance of daily embodied drudgery. When Western men banished color from their formal wardrobe, they marked themselves as unmarked, while women and many non-white men took on both the burden and freedom of decoration. These colors that are not colors deserve attention for connections between conformity in masculine fashion and ingrained ideas of masculine civic authority and the moral authority of whiteness. Remember the men may seem like an odd rallying cry for 2020, but I hope in my research to shine light on constructed forms of masculinity that have been hiding in plain sight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloe. Next up is Andre Jackson. Andre is an artist interested in mining personal history through poetry, weaving, sculpture, apparel, and performance to spark conversation about difficult issues related to identity. The title of his presentation, Investigating Masculinities, the Art of Andre Terrel Jackson.
Thank you for joining us for this final presentation. And I also want to thank TSA for allowing me to come back and speak about my work. I am Andre Terrel Jackson. I'm an artist working at the intersection of gender, race, and sexual orientation. My usual method of creating is often about blending together different visual motifs to explore hybrid identities, gender and race, masculinity and femininity, Blackness and queerness, etc. In an apparel piece entitled My Gender is Black, I created an idealized non-binary wardrobe. The goal was to be gender full instead of genderless, as well as tell a story unique to my Black American experience. Most of my work celebrates the fact that I was raised by Black women and serves as a reclamation of femme identity for myself. However, a small voice began to grow in my mind. What is masculinity? Arguably, the way I present in daily life is masculine assumed. However, my self-image does not align. I began to think about my personal entry into understanding some of masculinity through the suit. A masculinity that is far from my personal brand of masculinity, if I even have one at all. To me, the suit represents a specific aspiration, manhood connected to dominance, power, and assimilation. During my formative years, I was required to wear a shirt, tie, and trousers, and occasionally a blazer as a specific dress code in private school. I also had to wear suits to church on Sundays as a kid. In Ashley Morgan's article, The Suit Maketh the Man, Masculinity and Social Class in Kingsman, The Secret Service, Vaughan, 2014, Morgan talks about the transformative power of the suit, specifically the bespoke suit. Protagonist Gary Eggsy Unwin begins this film clothed in streetwear, denoting a chav identity. He ends the film transformed into one of the titular Kingsmen, and through extensive espionage training, which includes donning a bespoke suit, the suit allows Eggsy to become a gentleman and superhero of sorts, saving the world from a casually dressed, criminally insane American tech billionaire. Morgan notes, hegemonic men wear suits in a bid to convey power. Arguably, the suit homogenizes appearances so that the focus is more on what hegemonic men might say than how they might look. The uniformity is a means by which men of a lower social class who wear suits demonstrate aspiration to a higher social class and might affect hegemonic power through wearing them. All clothing has meaning. However, the suit acts in similar ways to masculinity itself, operating almost as a default idea above critique, investigation, or explanation. In Morgan's article, she talks about the bespoke suit's ability to correct so-called flaws in the wearer's appearance. In Chapter 3 of Fashion in Focus, Tim Edwards takes this idea further by offering the suit is arguably as much a symbol of masculine sexuality in terms of broadening shoulders and chest as it is a practical, if somewhat uncomfortable, uniform of respectability. Edward goes on to talk about the role of clothing as it performs in reinforcing gender difference. As a non-binary queer person, I'd like to take that further and say that clothing genders the body as much as we might believe the body genders clothing. I would like to call back to the title of the piece in the second slide, My Gender is Black. The title for this piece comes from an article of the same name written by Hari Zayed and published by Afropunk in 2017. In this article, Zayed calls their gender Black because Blackness already defies the rules of gender, which more often intersect with whiteness, wealth, and power than Blackness and queerness. In fact, Monica Miller's book, Slaves to Fashion, explores this notion through her exploration of the Black dandy. In Chapter 2, Miller speaks of crimes of fashion through a combination of costumed fashion celebrations like Negro Election Day and Pinkster, blackface minstrel shows, and novels depicting Blacks during and after American slavery. She states, at stake in the perpetuation of a crime of fashion by or on a Black dandy is the status of who is and can be a natural born Gemin, as Blacks transition from slaves to free people. Within the same chapter, Monica L. Miller talks about fashion's ability, specifically the suit, to separate the house slave whose appearance reflects on his master and the field slave who only dresses up on Sundays and one other day each year, often recycling the same few garments throughout the week. Bell Hooks, in her book, We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity, says initially, Black males did not see themselves as sharing the same standpoint as white men about the nature of masculinity. They had to be taught to equate their status as men with the right to dominate women. They had to be taught patriarchal masculinity. One of the ways this was accomplished was by connecting the suits with the performance of masculinity. Miller mentions a form of punishment in which slave owners would make male slaves don women's clothing to humiliate them. I'd argue this was also a way to reinforce Euro-American ideas of sexuality and gender. Within my studio practice, the creative informs the scholarship and the scholarship informs the creative. In this budding series, Queerly Suited, I offer a vision of masculinity at the intersection of gender, race, and sexual orientation. Pulling from some of my favorite men's suiting patterns, stripes, twills, and plaids celebrate and complicate a rich history of masculine, Black, and queer identifications. This is not a masculinity concerned with manhood, but a masculinity that views the sartorial as genesis for self-declaration. Tim Edwards speaks of the blended history of menswear, specifically the suit, through the use of a dichotomy of the Puritan and the Playboy. He says decorous masculinity was only truly demonstrated within a minority, namely the aristocracy, and the dull gray suit of the late 19th century was accompanied by city pinstripes, dashing evening dress, and candy-colored leisure wear. However, Monica Miller talks about the sartorial tradition of expressive and explosive style African Americans and Africans in America presented. She says Africans may have arrived in America physically and metaphorically naked, a seeming tabula rasa on which European and new American fashions might be imposed, but they had likely not forgotten the customs and aesthetic practices that had governed their lives in Africa. In a 1963 article by Jack Schwartz entitled Men's Clothing and the Negro, Schwartz speaks of the adoption of twilled red flannel shirts, Scotch caps, and check shirts by Ivy League upper middle class whites, a style, he says, worn almost exclusively by Negroes in slavery and afterward. Within the same section, Schwartz quotes a Black writer who says, "They call it the Ivy look, but ask any haberdasher worth his salt and he'll tell you it really started in Harlem rather than Harvard." Yet, when the Negro's uninhibited contribution to the American way of life became so acceptable that jazz entered the concert halls, it was just a matter of time before a Harvard lad would discover that a Harlem hustler's cap was appropriate for hot rodding and MG. While not exclusively about suiting, this passage speaks to an exchange of sartorial ideas and masculinity through dress. Schwartz also makes mention of clothing worn by slaves who worked as serving staff, being in his words, dressed in elaborate livery and carefully trained to reflect the wealth of the master. He makes note of embroidered waistcoats, striped trousers, and fancy silk handkerchiefs. In many ways, the creation of Black identity by whites in an othering of the enslaved and free Africans, and by those same Africans pushing back against negative images imposed on them, created the visual vernacular through which we read masculinity today. In The Devil's Cloth, author Michel Pastoureau tracks the history of the stripe as a visual motif used to denote wickedness, marginalize, categorize, as well as emphasize. Pastoureau states, "There's hardly any documentation for plain fabric because it represents the ordinary, the quotidian, the norm. For the stripe, on the other hand, there's plenty because it causes disorder, because it makes some noise." Michel Pastoureau's history of the stripe deserves its own 20-minute presentation, but I would like to highlight two pieces of important contextual information for Queerly Suited. In speaking of the evolution of the stripe between the 16th and 19th century, Pastoureau notes a trend within Italian courts to dress Black male slaves in stripes. Well into the 19th century, there was an association between Black men and striped clothing, irrespective of social rank. This stripe takes on multiple meanings from slave to servant to savage by nature of the body it was placed upon. Throughout his book, Michel Pastoureau speaks to the multiple pasts and presents stripes embody. Stripes represent the prostitute, the slave, the prisoner, the clown, the rebel, the knight, the clan, the sophisticate, et al. With all of that said, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the loom in all of this. Briefly, at the end of 2018, I came across a 4-shaft loom on Facebook, and after a few messages, I drove to Philadelphia to acquire it. I was spoiled in graduate school to begin my weaving career on a digital jacquard loom, creating fabrics out of various yarns, text, and images. Being forced to go from almost infinite shafts down to 4 forced me to think about fabric making in a new way. Similarly, the development of the suit was greatly impacted by technological advances. Edwards credits advances in tailoring techniques and the innovation of the sewing machine for the development of the modern suit. In my case, the acquisition of old technology became the seed for inspiration. In closing, I would like to leave you with this image of the 44th President of the United States, a mixed race Black man who also occupies a hybrid identity. I'm not sure if you recall this tan suit or the uproar it caused, but I remember that sartorial moment as if it were hanging in the closet of my mind. I saw that suit as signifying, a nod to the masculine identity I grew up around and many Black Americans are familiar with. In a later chapter of her book, Slaves to Fashion, Monica L. Miller quotes the artist Ike Ude to modernize the Black dandy. Style is not just about form and substance, it is also about the luxurious deliberation of intelligence in the face of boundaries. While this presentation has explored what I call the creation of masculinity through a focus on manhood, I hope this presentation begins to open your mind to the transformative and transcendent nature of gender expression as it leaves the intersection of whiteness, maleness, heterosexuality, and power, and finds other intersections through race, gender, and sexuality. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. And our final presenter, Raul Cornier. Raul is a recent graduate of the University of Rhode Island, Department of Textiles, fashion merchandising and design, and currently works at Harvard University. And Raoul's presentation, Hanky Panky, the cultural impact of the gay hanky code.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks again. Let's dive right into it. So I'm going to assume that people did not Google this. So what is the Hanky code? The Hanky code is a sartorial system, coding system to advertise sexual availability and sexual fetishes. It consists of wearing a bandana in your back pocket, and the color of the bandana represents a particular sexual fetish, and the placement of the bandana indicates the role in that fetish. If it's behind your left, it is you identify as a top or dominant. If it's in the bottom, if it's in the right, you identify as a bottom in the particular role. If you were both, you identify as versatile. The Hanky code itself kind of consists of two objects, the bandanas and the decoder lists. The high use period that I noted, that I learned in my research, starts around the mid-1970s and goes through the mid-1980s. My sense is that there were some early adopters in the early 70s and even probably in the late 1960s. The Hanky code was used predominantly by gay men or gay identifying men. Language associated with the Hanky code, in particular, the word flagging, which is the act of wearing a bandana to invoke the Hanky code. And the act of searching for an anonymous sexual encounter is known as cruising. And these fetishes were both behavior-based fetishes, something you're participating in, as well as identity fetishes, fetish for someone or something that you identify as. So many typeset lists were available with the purchase of bandanas at queer novelty shops, queer erotica shops, bookstores. They were pocket-sized to be carried as a reference, and they were also used as an opportunity to for marketing purposes, as you can see in the two examples that I have on the screen. They were also published in erotic magazines and in BDSM community newsletters, as well as printed on flyers. BDSM stands for bondage, discipline, and sadomasochism, also commonly known as the leather community. So the Hanky code is one of a series of queer sartorial codes during the 20th century. While there were sartorial codes that existed before, they weren't as complex. We'll start like in the 1920s into the 1940s, where particular colors were associated with homosexuality, in particular green, red, and lavender. So if you wore these colors as a tie or as a handkerchief in your front pocket of your blazer, then it could be assumed that you were associated with homosexuality. Suede shoes in the 1930s, and single stud earrings being worn into the 1930s into the 1980s, depending on what side, and I think the side had regional connotations, so wearing it on the left versus the right versus left. And then starting in the 1950s and 60s with the popularity of biker culture, wearing keys on your belt loop also served as a sexual signifier. Not only did this serve as a signifier to identify you as gay or queer, but wearing it on one side versus the other also presented the information of availability or a sexual role. So some of the findings that I found during my research, Hanky codes, many of the early ones that I found that were dated, I'm speaking specifically about decoder lists, began with the color red. The fetish and color inconsistencies among them, so not every Hanky code is identical to each other. There may have been regional differences or really preference differences based on what was selected. They followed heteronormative constructs of gender and identity and masculinity. And there are references in art, film, music, literature, and fashion. Some of the ambiguous origins is rooted in satire, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And the hanky coat as a phenomenon responds to cultural shifts in society, or at least in the queer community, with additions of colors and fetish associations. This image here is from the book Band of Bikers, which was published in 2006 from a collection of images from the 1970s. And this one in particular is from 1972. So it's a very early image. As the phenomenon gained popularity beyond the BDSM subculture in the mid-1970s, hanky coat imagery became a visual shorthand for queer male identity. So you start to see like these books here were targeted specifically to gay men, and doing that using this kind of bandana in a back pocket imagery. It exists in ephemera, events such as hanky coat themed bar nights, erotica, and mainstream film, as well as art, music, and literature. Here are a couple of examples of hanky coat themed bar night flyers or invitations from the Leather Archives in Chicago, Illinois. And here are some recent examples of hanky coat nights at leather bars, one in New York City and the right in Providence. Some more cultural references that I found, specifically in literature, references to the hanky coat and Dancer from the Dance, Tales from the City. In film, the movie Cruising, the hanky coat features very prominently in that movie, as well as the biopic for Tom of Finland that recently came out a couple years ago. There's a very subtle reference in the a sketch comedy television show In Living Color from the 1990s, where flagging is used as a double reference for a joke. There are references in music, in particular, the Hanky Code by Peaches, which is actually a song that was released in the early 2000s, as well as in music videos. The original band version for the song Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, you can find it on YouTube, shows kind of this bacchanal style leather bar, and you see a lot of the extras in leather gear and wearing bandanas in their back pocket. And the video for the song House of Air actually references or was inspired by the photographic work of Hal Fisher, who I'll talk about shortly as well. And in terms of fashion, a recent exhibition at the MoMA, I believe the first fashion exhibition in 40 some odd years, had a presentation of red bandanas, and within that presentation, the hanky code was referenced as a cultural history of the bandana. And more specifically, also the Versace men's collection from fall 2014, which references the bandana motif, or is reinterpreted in that presentation, in that collection. So a couple of examples of photography that has been published. And these two examples are from the gay pride marches in the late 1970s. These two examples are kind of more staged examples of hanky code presentation. The one on the right in particular is by Hal Fisher, as I mentioned before, and is published in his book, Gay Semiotics, where he documents different gay archetypes in this kind of photo essay treatment. And here we have an unknown painting by an unknown person on the left, and on the right, a drawing by Tom of Finland, who is a very well-known an artist, at least in the gay community, and has, I think, recently been received some more mainstream notoriety. In that, I looked really hard to find an image of his with someone wearing a bandana, and you can see it very subtly near his wrist brace. As well as in contemporary art, this is an example by Vincent Chevalier. This piece is called Blank Hanky, bottom right. And it is a performance art piece where he has an outline of back pocket and exposed bandana tattooed to his body. And the piece demonstrates, and what he does is that he fills in the color according to what his fetishistic interest is that at that moment. And the piece demonstrates how our sexual interests can become part of our identity, and also responds to the performative aspects of the Hanky Code. So where does it start, or how does it start? There really wasn't a formal start. There was no Hanky Code Council. It just kind of happened. There's no documented evidence of the official start. But what I did find was some these three origin stories that would come up throughout my research. The details would always change, but they were kind of categorized into these three areas. This kind of practical joke story, where a store clerk from one of these queer novelty or erotica shops in San Francisco decided to assign fetishes to colored bandanas beyond the red and blue ones that had currently existed and were sold for those purposes. And apparently it caught on. The other story is a story about someone needing to write an article for some gay publication in the mid-1970s about cruising and the use of sartorial codes. And some reference the Village Voice, but no one can find that article. So that's another one of the stories that has circulated. And then finally, this third story circulated in regards to this image on the screen, which is the image of a 19th century stag dance. It starts to circulate in the early 2000s. In early settlement towns out west, men would have to find ways to entertain themselves because there weren't many women, and the stag dance was one of those kind of ways to do that, and to do it in a way of identifying gender without other women being there. So you would tie a bandana around your arm, and if you tied it on the left arm, I believe you led, and the right arm would be, you would follow. On the origin story that identifies the Hanky Code as a result of a practical joke or prank lends itself to this idea that, you know, satire is part of the Hanky Code from a very early point. Early Hanky Codes that I have found have joke or color fetish associations. For example, one from 1975 that I found illustrates the color puce as, I quote, someone who wants a discussion of pre-Minoan art. So you go through all these, you know, sexual fetishes and then that. Some oral history interviews record the early days of kind of cruising and Hanky Code flagging, and kind of the absurdity of determining or trying to figure out fetishes in dark bars and in dark public spaces. And it continues today in satirical journalism and internet comedy videos. A couple of them, one called The Handkerchief Code by Funny or Die, and the new Hanky Code by Justin Sayer. Here's an example of a game Monopoly game that I found where the Hanky Code does figure prominently with this Tom of Finland-like imagery in the bottom center, as well as some kind of question card of a figure there with many bandanas tied behind their back pocket. As I researched the evolution of the Hanky Code and its timeline, I noticed a shift in its use. In the wake of the AIDS crisis, it appears to go back underground as anonymous sexual encounters were deemed a high risk for HIV transmission. Eventually, there was public education about safer sex practices, and it was a result of that, this black and white check image or motif was starting to be used. So on newer Hanky Codes in the 1990s, you'll see this black and white check as safer sex, quote unquote fetish. Other fetishes that appear are ethnicity-based fetishes where these striped fetishes with particular colors are supposed to represent people's ethnic identity. So black represented African Americans or fetish for African Americans. Brown represents a fetish for Latinos, and yellow represents a fetish for Asians. From 2020 lens, this does appear problematic as it positions white men as the primary users and others, people of color within the community, which was predominantly white, cisgender, and male. However, we now starting to see adaptations to other identities of the Hanky Code for these newer subcultures within the LGBT community. And I mean, femme flagging is the newer concept, but the lesbian Hanky Code itself has existed since the late 1970s, but we kind of recontextualized in this feminized version where it was always identified as this kind of associated with masculinity. Pup flagging, I won't go into it now, but you can Google what a gay pup is and you'll find out what it is, but they also decided to have a flag as well for their identity. Trans flagging, the use of a plaid bandana or a plaid handkerchief to identify as a trans person. So no longer, so the Hanky Code is really now no longer exclusive to just fetish presentation. It's now taking into consideration a person's identity. In the last 15 to 20 years, interest in the Hanky Code inspired these BDSM fetish wear designers or fetish gear designers to incorporate colored leather trim on their black leather garments. So the typical leather uniform was all black leather. And I found a reference in the late 1990s of this kind of new treatment where it's trimmed with these colors that were referenced in the Hanky Code. These leather garments, along with colored shoelaces, suspenders, socks, underwear, t-shirts, now provide an opportunity to flag beyond just using a bandana. Apparel companies such as Nasty Pig produce fashion clothing and apparel with fetishist sensibilities for queer men. And one can now present as queer and sexual practices can be part of one's identity. So here's some examples of fetish wear that I found. The typical, in addition to like all leather, typical kind of uniform is a colored jockstrap with the socks. And here are some Hanky Code themed t-shirts. Now as we see in high fashion, the Versace menswear collection in fall 2014 adapted this bandana motif for underwear, handkerchiefs, and shirts, paired with leather chaps and biker jackets. According to Jessica Michel of nowfashion.com, the collection was inspired by cowboys and bikers, which are two culturally significant queer male archetypes. Tim Blanks of style.com references that part of the collection as looking like showboys from a Vegas review inspired by Kenneth Anger's underground biker classic, Scorpio Rising. We also see references, of course, in the internet and in social media. There are references in Wikipedia, Urban Dictionary, numerous articles and listicles on queer sexuality and nostalgia. There is a lot of image collecting and curating via Pinterest and Instagram. There was a Hanky Code app in 2009. You could set your phone to it and put it in your back pocket. I don't think it exists anymore. And there is Hanky Code flagging in this kind of new way in queer social dating apps such as Grindr, Scruff, and Recon. And these images represent those kind of profile images. I did use them with their consent. And here in the age of COVID-19, we have this someone at some point on Twitter decided to create this face mask code. So that circulated earlier in April, and a couple of companies, including Mr. S Leather and the image in the center from a company called Burley Shirts, have repurposed this bandanas and bandana motif to create face masks for people. So some of the conclusions that I had doing this research is that the Hanky Code is the longest running queer sartorial code in continuous use. The Hanky Code most likely began with gay practitioners of brachioproctic insertion in San Francisco. I need to look that up. The Hanky Code phenomenon evolved from a covert sexual signaling system to a form of open expression celebrating sexuality and identity. Interest in queer nostalgia and history has prompted a resurgence in the Hanky Code phenomenon for its originally intended purposes, and as well for queer identity presentation. And I do conclude that the Hanky Code has significantly impacted and contributed to queer culture. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Raul. So now we will move to the Q&A period. Just before I do want to apologize to any of the presenters if I got your pronouns wrong. I should have asked in advance about that, so my apologies. But let's begin with the questions, and I'm just going to go through them in the order that they were submitted. So let's see. For Cecilia, can you tell us how large were the handkerchiefs and did they change in size over time? Also, how do you relate to the size of the banquet napkins?
Well, the extant handkerchiefs do vary in size, and some are quite small, like almost 6 inches square. And there are some documents relating to these small handkerchiefs that were given as kind of love tokens, could be purchased and given as little love tokens because they wouldn't really be useful for blowing your nose. And then some of them are quite large, like 1.5 feet square. And especially in some of the portraits, you can see they're very large. So there's a lot of variation, and the napkins at that time were also very large, larger than the ones that we would have today. So I think there's a lot of, there wasn't standardization like we have now with more mass production.
Okay, thank you. And Chloe, were these black fabrics ever made from wool from black sheep? If not, why not?
That is such a great question. Thanks for the question. I have no idea is the answer. There also was a real transition from blue and navy blue tailcoats into black. So sometimes it's hard to tell exactly, which color things are. And also, the things that are unique about this ensemble make it like resistant to collection. So I'm really looking for objects that are American. So if any attendees are associated with collections that have any men's evening suits from the first half of the 19th century, I'd be very interested in knowing about them. I'll put my email in the chat so that you guys can contact me or you can connect through the app. But I would love to do some dye analysis or look more extensively into individual garments, especially ones that have provenance, because of course it's really difficult to know for menswear what date, and doing time of day research also is very complicated in archives too. So thanks for the question. I wish I could answer it.
Okay, and Andre, what are your plans for your queerly suited yardage?
Thank you. I am actually planning on using them as in multiple ways, primarily as canvas. But recently I have been thinking about how to kind of extend their use through kind of digital collage and some interruptions of current style with some of the kind of out of style-ness of the patterns that I've used. So thank you.
Okay, well, let's do Raul. Have you considered the possible origin of the hanky code being in 1950s biker leather culture?
It's a possibility. I think that's where the keys on the belt loop started. Um, None of the research or the documents that exist right now indicate that it started at that early. So when I talk about the early adopters, it's possible, but I'm not so sure that it's as possible that bandanas are being used that early. At least in the late 60s, maybe mid 60s. But it is possible. There's just no documentation, and I couldn't find any references to it starting that early.
And Raul, I think this is for you too. I think, was the Springsteen cover for Born in the USA in any way a reference to?
The cover is not a bandana. I think it's a baseball cap. So I think it's just kind of these motifs of Americana, which a bandana also is. I don't know if it's in reference to that. If it is, it's another kind of coded reference for maybe gay Springsteen fans. I don't know.
Okay, another question for Cecilia, but so I will ask that, but while I'm doing that, I will ask all of the presenters, because there are so many connections between your papers, if you might have questions for each other that could start a dialogue as well. But for Cecilia, I have a question about needle lace production. Can you speak to the differences between the makers who would have produced higher end needle laces made to shape versus those that were made in yardage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And hi, Elena. And I'll just say thank you. Elena showed me the pieces at the Met that I included in my presentation. So we've been talking about this. And I think that's like the open question. And maybe just the handkerchief borders that happen to survive were the nicer, fancier ones that people saved, that were made to shape. And maybe we know that there was trimming made as yardage, because we have lots of yarded, just trims that aren't attached to anything, that we have no idea what it was attached to originally. And maybe some of that was on handkerchiefs, right? So I think we just don't know. Like as I was trying to figure this out, doing this research, there's just so much of the lace that survives, as you know, is decontextualized, and it's hard to reconstruct what it was originally part of, which is one reason why I like looking at pieces that are still, or lace that is still attached to a complete piece, because then you can maybe start to reconstruct how some of it was used. But I think that's a great question, and I don't know the answer.
So we have a few more questions, but any questions you'd like to ask each other before we move on to those?
I'll just say, Chloe, I loved your talk, and all the things you were talking. I like the material approach you're taking to color and to the removal of color, and all that stuff you were saying about bleaching. I've been thinking about several centuries before the bleaching, and the whiteness and the connotations of whiteness and the development of that. So it was great to hear.
I also just wanted to say how wonderful it is to be on a panel talking about men and masculinity and textiles, especially ones that are talking about laundry and queer theory. It's just been so wonderful hearing all of your research, and I messaged all of you through the app. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you. Maybe we can have a virtual happy hour some other time and talk about our research.
Okay, well, let me ask a few more questions from here. Chloe, I loved your phrase that women and men of color were given the burden and freedom of decoration. Can you speak more to this idea?
Sure, thanks for the question. It's something that I really have been, wrestling with and trying to figure out what it means to wear a uniform. When I first started working on this project, I thought, wouldn't everyone like to wear a uniform? because you don't have to make as many decisions, you don't have to spend as much money on clothes. And it was really interesting. I got a lot of feedback from men in their 60s that were like, I hated suits. I felt like it was confining. I didn't want to support the man. And that was really interesting for me. And then I also started hearing from women and gay men in particular who were like, I want to, you know, have a self-expression and wear color and operate around this. So it's been really useful hearing that kind of personal feedback from people in order to develop these kind of methods, thinking about, you know, it's not just a trap having a uniform. It's also, it's both a trap and you have access to this sort of simplicity. So that has been a nuanced component to trying to think through the idea of this relationship between conformity and masculinity, and white masculinity in particular.
And Raul, have you seen examples of textile art that reference the Hanky code, repurposes the hankies, etc.?
Yes, they do. There are a lot of wonderful queer contemporary artists right now who, through nostalgia, because a lot of them are young, are discovering the Hanky code and incorporating it into artwork. One person is Zach Petot, I'm not pronouncing his last name right, P-E-T-O-T. He's somebody I follow on Instagram. So yeah, there are people who are using it and using it as a form of discussing their queer sexuality in terms of their identity, which is something that I discovered through this research, and I thought was a wonderful thing.
And Andre, did you see or know about the exhibition at RISD, Artist Rebel Dandy? It featured weaving as well as amazing looks of dandies.
No, I did not, but I will now be checking it out.
Okay. And let's see. Chloe, another question. Can you comment on the use of black and white today? I'm curious about your perspective on how the themes you touched on are present today.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the way that I see it primarily is through the idea of the tuxedo, which is sort of the second evolution of this formal masculine evening suit. And the idea that the tuxedo is always borrowed from men, that it's seen as sort of a power move or hypersexual for its borrowing from the male wardrobe for women. Even though women have been wearing masculine evening dress inspired outfits for 100 years, like when is it going to get to be something that women actually can embody and own and not have it just be constantly borrowing? So that's the primary place where I see it today. I'm sure there are other spaces where I have yet to encounter it. So if anyone has any thoughts about thinking through colors beyond the evening suit with me in terms of gender, I'd be really interested in those conversations.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the time and it's 8:02, and I know that people get zoomed out, including myself. So there are still a few more questions, but I think we'll leave it here and say good night to everybody. And thank you to our presenters. It was really a fascinating panel. So thanks for being here and sharing your research and your work. And thanks to TSA. And I know there's a film tonight coming up at 8:30 too. So hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And I always just remember when we're at the conference, this is the time when you usually see people with their luggage leaving, and they don't have, a lot of people don't stay for this time. So that's the nice part about being on Zoom, is that we actually had a really big audience for your presentation. So thanks again, and take care, everyone.